Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about the beginning of Buddha's preaching. So this is part 4 of our book, 4 fundamental questions. And the fundamental question for this part of the book is, what should I do and who should I be? So how do you live your life? And this is the story of Buddha returning to these 5 friends of his, formerly friends of his, with whom he practiced severe austerities, eating only enough to keep himself alive, drinking only enough water to keep himself alive. So pushing himself to the brink of death. And then he realized that it wasn't working. So he left and he discovered the middle path between self-indulgence and that kind of extreme self-torture, self-mortification. So he's walking back, and his friends, his former ascetic practitioners, saw him coming, and they say, "Oh, look, here comes Buddha. Or, here comes our former brother who gave up the austerities to go live in abundance. So when he comes, we'll let him sit down, but don't get up and offer him a bowl of water to wash his feet with or take his robe or anything else. No special ceremony for this guy because he's a slacker." Then he walked in, and despite themselves, they all rushed to help him and got him a bowl for washing his feet and took his robe and put a seat down for him and greeted him. And then he told them, "I've discovered the ultimate insight, the transcendent truth. I've attained complete enlightenment." And then they said, "Well, how did you do that, considering you gave up the hardcore path that you formerly practiced with us?" And then he said, "Have I ever," here, I'll just read the bottom of page 394. "Do you perceive, brethren, that I have never spoken to you thus before now? Never thus, reverend sir." So then, just by repeating the facts to him that I have achieved this immortal knowledge, his presence and his demeanor finally convinced them. So they listened to his instruction, and at the top of page 395 he said, "Then the Lord addressed the 5 brethren. These 2 extremes, brethren, are not to be practiced by one who has given up the world." What are the 2? The one, devotion to lusts and pleasures, base, sensual, vulgar, ignoble, and useless, and the other, devotion to self-mortification, painful, ignoble, and useless. By avoiding these 2 extremes, brethren, the Tathagata has gained perfect knowledge of the middle path, which produces insight and knowledge and conduces to tranquility, to transcendent knowledge, to complete enlightenment, to nirvana. What is this middle path, brethren? It is the Noble Eightfold Path. That is," then he does this list of these 8 proper paths of life, which consist of right views, right aspiration, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right endeavor, right watchfulness, and right meditation. So if you read on page 393 in Richard Bilsker's intro paragraph, he lists those 8 and kind of gives a little definition of each one of those. And then he says, "This, brethren, is the middle path, of which the Tathagata has gained perfect knowledge." I think that's how you pronounce that word, Tathagata. "Which produces insight and knowledge and conduces to tranquility, supernatural faculty, to complete enlightenment, to nirvana. This, brethren, is," so here's the 4 noble truths of Buddhism. And the first is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, old age is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with unpleasant things is suffering, separation from pleasant things is suffering. Not obtaining what we wish is suffering. In short, the 5-fold clinging to existence is suffering. And this, brethren, is the noble truth of the cause of suffering, which is craving, which causes rebirth, accompanied by pleasure and lust, and rejoices at finding delight here and there, that is, craving for pleasure, craving for existence, and craving for prosperity. That's the second noble truth. The first is existence is suffering. The second is craving causes suffering. The third noble truth is the truth of the destruction of suffering, which is the complete and trackless destruction of that thirst. So to destroy craving is to destroy suffering. It's abandonment and relinquishment, liberation and aversion. And this, brethren, is the noble truth of the path that leads to the destruction of suffering, that is, and then he repeats the Eightfold Path. So, discussion question 1 on page 397. Contrast the view here with the one found in Hinduism. What are the main similarities and differences? So the main similarities are they both advise repeatedly tranquility of the mind. Stop craving for things, because if you do, you'll just suffer the pairs of opposites. Rejoicing in when you've got it, lamenting when you lose it, fearing to lose it when you do have it, suffering when you actually do lose things. So anything that you crave will just cause you to suffer. So renounce that kind of craving. And Krishna to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, his advice for how can I renounce craving, which is so essential to life, and his advice was, well, realize you're not the body. The body are like clothes, you can put them on and take them off, but your soul is eternal. So realize that you should just devote yourself as a soul to the Supreme Soul, which Krishna says is me. And in the Katha Upanishad, the first reading of the whole book, the Supreme Soul is called Vishnu. So Krishna is Vishnu, and that's how Krishna advises Arjuna to gain a tranquil mind by renouncing the desires for material pleasure, including, in Arjuna's sake, the pleasure of living in a peaceful life after having caused the destruction of his entire family line. So he was worried, I'll be miserable if I win, I'd rather die. And Krishna says, don't be attached to your misery or your happiness. Let the future be what it will. Just focus on doing your duty, because you should realize you're a part of me and I'm the Supreme Being. So that is different than Buddhism, as we know from the chariot analogy of Nagasena from the first part of the book. The Buddhist philosophy is anatman, no atman, no individual soul. So that's the major difference, as it always is, between Hinduism and Buddhism. Buddhism grew out of Hinduism and rejected the idea of an individual soul. But it did grow out of Hinduism, and so there's obviously a lot of similarities, including reincarnation. Well, how can there be reincarnation if there's no individual soul? That's an important philosophical question, and for Buddhists, it's not the soul that's reincarnating, it's just the material cravings and karma itself, kind of like a whirlpool, and if you stop identifying with it, then it can just merge back into nirvana. And I've compared nirvana to the Brahman side of the Atman Brahman polarity in Hinduism. The soul is Atman, an individual particular soul, and at the same time it's Brahman, a wave in the ocean of impersonal eternal being, which seems to be what the nirvana is for Buddhism. You want to lose the individuality and merge back into this immortal but impersonal state that doesn't consist of different parts but is one homogeneous thing that has no sense of self. And another major similarity between the two is control your sense desires. So they both say it. All right, so we've gone over that. Discussion question 2 on page 397. What would life be like for someone following the Eightfold Path? Explain. So if that is a question on the exam, you can answer it any way you want, so long as you refer back to the text and I can tell that you understand the text. The Eightfold Path is the right views, right aspiration. What would life be like for someone doing that? You could say maybe, I don't know, it would be hard because you'd never be able to, cut the corners to make a little extra money, or you'd be happy, you wouldn't have worries. There's different ways you could explain it, but the main thing is, do you know what the Eightfold Path is? Discussion question 3. The Buddha calls following the Four Noble Truths a middle path between two extremes. Explain this idea. Make sure to include an explanation of the two extremes. So that's right at the top of page 395. And the two extremes are devotion to lusts and pleasures on the one hand, and self-mortification on the other. So Buddhism, I think most people in America today, at any rate, would say, oh, it is extreme. You know, you're not allowed to have intoxication. You're not allowed to have sex for any other reason than procreation. You know, technically the rules are, so that's an extreme self-mortification. Well, Buddha would say, if you think that's self-mortification, you should have seen what I was doing with these 5 other guys, starving ourselves, you know, to the brink of death for the sake of trying to release ourselves from the perpetual cycle of suffering. So, but that's not the way to go. You know, eat as much as you need to stay healthy, drink as much as you need to stay healthy, and have a family, but don't go, you know, however strict the sexual licenses are, probably if it's just for procreation, that's would be considered pretty intense, but at any rate, it's the middle path between the two extremes, and it's pretty self-explanatory. So we will leave it at that. The next video is going to be about the next reading, which will be Confucius's The Doctrine of the Mean. So again, this middle path between two extremes.